I'm Tass Mellis of The Starters.
This is Ben Golliver with the Open Floor Podcast.
Hi, I'm Kristen Ludlow from NBA Inside Stuff.
I'm OG Anunoby of the Toronto Raptors.
Hey, I'm Elena Donon, and welcome to the Double Clutch.
Double Clutch.
Double Clutch. Double Clutch.
Double Clutch Podcast.
Point game. Just play the game.
Just play the game. I learned that from you. You better D up, Jake.
Welcome to the Double Clutch Basketball Movies podcast. I'm your usual host, Josh Coyne, and I'm joined by Nick Whitfield. Hello, Nick.
Hey, Josh. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. And Mike Miller, how's it hanging?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm not bad, thank you. Keeping safe, staying clean. How are you guys dealing with the self-isolation period?
Washing my hands to the point where I got eczema.
Ooh. I haven't had eczema
brutal.
yet, but I have had skin so dry on my knuckles that they cracked, and I think I look like I do bricklaying or something for a living, and all I do is type at a desk.
I see you more as a bare-knuckle boxer, Mike.
Yeah, maybe I have to shave that little tash in and wear the leotard.
Okay, we've already got to leotards and we're less than a minute in. So driving straight into the lane with unrivaled aggression, we're covering the movie He Got Game today. It's a 1998 Spike Lee joint, primarily based in Coney Island, New York. It was his first film to open at number one at the box office. Amazingly, it was filmed in just 23 days. Firstly, lads, take me through your relationship with the film and the part it played in your love of the game. First, I'll go ahead and throw it to Nick.
So, it's coming out in 1998. I am 14 years old at that point. I'm in pretty much maybe year 3 or so of my basketball obsession. And so it was a natural fit for everything I was interested in and seemed to dominate my life at that point. It was actually really funny watching it back with my wife last night, who 10 minutes into the movie commented on the clothes people were wearing and said, "Oh, now I understand your wardrobe a bit better." So that probably goes some way to talking about the impact it had on my life. Not just the movie, obviously, but how well it represented fashion of that period in basketball, and how that sort of impacted me into my mid-30s.
What about you, Mike?
Yeah, I'm desperately praying that Nick's got one of those sleeveless polo shirts that Booger wears in the opening scrimmage scene. For me, I can't remember when I first came across the film or became aware of it. I definitely didn't see it at the cinema, but I reckon it would have been early '99 for me, and I'm a similar age to Nick, a little bit older, 6 months or so. Let's just not to split my few remaining hairs, and I got it from Blockbuster Rental. I didn't know much about it at all, but just sort of recognised Ray Allen and didn't, for whatever reason, didn't recognise Denzel Washington at all, and went, I'm going to take this giant VHS home and watch it. And after that, it became sort of a staple regular rental until I bothered to buy it myself. And it's actually one of only 2 films I've bothered to buy on VHS and DVD. So it is right up there for me in terms of films that have played a big part in my evolution, shall we say.
Very nice. So obviously you just wanted that as part of the collection, whether it be VHS or DVD.
100%, and I've still got the VHS.
Just to go back to a digression, recently, I think I mentioned this in a previous podcast, but recently I was at a scrimmage within the last few months or so, when we were allowed to go outside. But I was in a scrimmage and I looked around and I kind of looked at my shorts, and I wasn't wearing those ridiculous kind of pajama bottoms that were kind of circulated around the internet a while back, but I was wearing over-the-knee basketball shorts, and I play with a team that is, I'd say the majority is younger, bar a few, than myself. And I felt like someone who would have been in the 90s wearing the Larry Bird kind of hot pants that they had in the 80s, where they look around and think, oh, okay, the game might have passed me by at this point because everything's cyclical, and now they wear those short shorts again, and I'm the old guy for wearing below the knee. But anyway, just to go to the fashion of He Got Game, I actually started to feel myself aging when I kept going back to the thought process of, man, I really miss basketball players looking like this. Did you have that feeling?
A little bit, but I'm not sure the dungaree short combo with the wife beater vest should be brought back anytime soon. I mean, I've not full on gone into the short realm. I still wear mine relatively baggy, but they've gone back up above the knee. And I was a bit slow on the baggy take as well. I remember one of my coaches used to take the piss out of me because I had some like Chicago Bulls champion shorts that I wore all the time. And I had them from like age 13 and was still wearing them at about age 17, by which point I'd grown like a foot. And they were above the cycling shorts. So I was a bit late on that one, but then I got, full on baggy. I've had ones that had a good few inches below my knees before. I don't know. There's definitely some parts of it I would like to see back. Maybe not necessarily the clothing, although the on-court gear I quite liked.
Yeah, that's largely what I mean. I mean, like when they're at the park and they're scrimmaging as opposed to, their streetwear. Mm-hmm. But Nick, when you look at the baggier stuff, which of course, and at the end of the day, the short shorts and the skin tight stuff always looks better on professional athletes, and I actually think it looks great now within the NBA kind of go-to style. But did you have that feeling of kind of nostalgia for the kind of no fear t-shirts and long baggy hoodies?
Yeah, I think it was the whole experience of watching the movie was nostalgic for me because of I would always listen to it either on the way, the soundtrack I would listen to on the way to games or on the way to shooting hoops or scrimmages and stuff. So everything from the fashion to the music, the sneakers, I just remember the ones either I had or my friends had during that time. So I think everything during the whole experience of watching that movie that obviously I'm a big fan of, but I don't think I have watched in, it must be at least 15 years. So yeah, the whole experience for me was super nostalgic.
So just to give some context of what we're actually talking about, I'm just going to go through a rundown of the synopsis. The story begins at a correctional facility where we're introduced to Jake Shuttlesworth, who is imprisoned for the accidental murder of his wife during a domestic dispute, played by Denzel Washington, who is brought into the warden's office, who advises him that he knows about the abilities of his son, Jesus Shuttlesworth, played by NBA legend Ray Allen. He's considered a top basketball prospect in the country. The warden advises the governor of New York he would like Jesus to enroll in his alma mater, Big State, in exchange for Jake's early release from prison. After we see some cutaways that suggest a testing father and son relationship, Jake is put into quarantine and he subsequently is released temporarily to convince his son. After they play a game of father and son one-on-one, filled with plenty of trash talk, Jesus is victorious. He rejects the declaration letter. Jake is immediately picked up to head back to the joint. He leaves Jesus with the message that if he doesn't make the right decisions, he'll end up just like him, instead of using basketball as the way out. Despite the volatility in their relationship, he commits to Big State, and yet Jake remains in jail to serve the rest of his sentence due to a technicality. Everybody else who Jake touched during the time outside moves on to more positive things, and with the closing shooting montage, the movie comes to an end. So obviously this is a fairly plot-heavy, ambitious movie for a sports movie. Did you feel as though it had the right level and the right balance between kind of strong narrative tension and celebrating the game of basketball? I'll go to Mike.
I found this really quite jarring. I always have done it, and it's even it's throughout the film, and it's even in the Aaron Copland, I can't remember how it's said, score that sort of follows the film the whole way through. You have these moments of just upbeat, uplifting Americana, sort of. I think the opening one in the montage is very much like she's coming around the mountain style music, and then all of a sudden you've got these really aggressive, dark tensions coming through, which are then obviously happen throughout the film itself. It's really quite jarring. They don't seem to blend, if you know what I mean. They're sort of like it's one or the other, and there's a very, like, the scene can just change in 1 second from being upbeat to just being really dark. And I don't know if balance is the right word, but that's there is sort of, I guess it is, because it's like an equilibrium between the two. The two extremes are there throughout the whole film. It's a weird one, because some of the dark stuff in there is really quite dark, for a 15. But yeah. I just think it's just incredibly well put together.
Yeah, so let's talk about the soundtrack itself then. We'll start with the official soundtrack. So let's talk about the major component of the movie, which is a soundtrack largely by Public Enemy. It was their 6th studio album released by Def Jam. Interestingly, it was lauded by critics but performed really badly in the charts. It peaked at 26th, even though the film was number 1 in the box office. It has endured a longer run in the kind of basketball lexicon, I guess. How many times has it soundtracked you playing basketball or working out?
Many times. Not so much in the past decade, but the title track especially is an all-time favourite. There was a short-lived festival called Common People that took place in Southampton and Oxford, and we took it as an opportunity to go drinking with mates, obviously, as you do. And I'd take my little brother. I say little brother. He's now 28 or so. But through and this is quite a recent festival. Through the years, obviously, I've influenced him to get into basketball, things like that, and he got game. Has been a part of that. And Public Enemy was somehow playing at this festival one year, and we were like, got to go see it. They're gonna play it. They played like 30 seconds of it, and it was the most let down I've been in a long time. The soundtrack was a big part of my basketball playing, young adulthood for sure. But I think the only track that's really stuck around is the title track for me these days.
And you were listening to that earlier today whilst working out, am I correct?
That is that is very much correct. I've got to say, I say the title track's the main one that sticks in my head. The as I said before we hit record, the Revelations 33 1/3 Revolutions with the James Bond style riff also is an absolute banger.
Yeah, well, after rewatching it yesterday and today, I went for a 5K run today, and I was listening to the whole thing, including on the way back. It didn't take me that long to run the 5K, just as a disclaimer. But Nick, what about was it often in the background whilst you were hooping when you were younger?
Yeah, I was mentioning this just before we came on, actually, to you guys, where I think probably more than any other album, I would play this just on repeat as I was walking to the court or on the bus to a game, or so it's kind of like every song from this album is pretty iconic in my memory. And it's a funny one where those because of how we consume music now in terms of streaming, it's one of those things that's been lost in the music experience a little bit, in terms of like knowing the sequence of tracks in an album, for example. And I think this one was absolutely masterful in how it was put together. I was a big Public Enemy fan already before I ever saw this movie. So the fact that when I heard they were doing the soundtrack as well, I couldn't believe it. And I think, like Mike was talking about there as well, where really the only song from this album that got sort of mainstream attention was the headline that shares the same name as the movie. But there was a lot of tracks with interesting messages as well, in terms of that mirrored the some of the messaging in the movie. In terms of, there's one called Super Agent, talking about how talking about sports agents and the role they play, or Politics of the Sneaker Pimps, which is another one in terms of how basketball is consumerized by big brands. So there's a lot of political messaging, as well as being filled with absolute bangers.
Yeah, and I mean, some people also wish that, Mike, you basically said it. Some people wish that there was more hip hop in the basketball scenes, but there are kind of classical overtures that make it sound almost like a Western. It gives that feeling of a basketball story based in the Wild West or something, which I guess in a way could be seen as a metaphor for the recruitment of collegiate athletes, if you really want to stretch that far. But speaking of the music, I mean, the opening montage, that shows kind of people, you know, the opening montage shows people of all walks of life, all ages, genders, playing basketball, to the symphonic score of, which I think is actually an ode to an African-American folk hero called John Henry. I think that's the title of the track. But the scene itself, that has to be the most impressive opening sequence to any basketball movie, in my opinion, isn't it?
100% is for me. It's amazing. When you said we were going to do this pod, I went to watch the film, and I must have gone to watch it about 20 times and not got further than the opening sequence, because I'd just stop and replay it, and then stop and replay it, because I think it's about 3 minutes 30 long, and it's just brilliant. You mentioned the musical score quickly there. So I was in New York in 2001, and I was like, I've got to get the He Got Game soundtrack. I've got to get it. I've got a bit of money. I went to the Virgin Mega Store. I don't know if it's still even there. I guess it is. But the 24-hour store in downtown New York, and did possibly the most English white thing you could do, and walked out with the wrong soundtrack and had picked up the classical score instead. And I didn't even clock it until I put it in, and I sat there for like 5 minutes going, what? Huh? And then I kept skipping tracks. I was like, oh no. And by then it was too late. But yeah, I've grown to love that score as well. But that opening montage is a thing of beauty.
That really reminds me of when I asked for the movie on DVD, Inglourious Bastards, the Quentin Tarantino movie, but my mum got me the 1940s war original film called Inglourious Bastards with an A. But that opening scene, Nick, doesn't it just kind of paint the game as a unifying and beautiful force of wonder?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, when I watch that, it really takes me back to when I was during my teenage years, which was the peak, I guess, of my playing basketball obsession. As just probably even more frequently than I'd be playing in games or at a team practice or scrimmaging with friends or whatever, probably even more frequently than that, I'd just be shooting on a hoop on my own. And I think that because you see people playing in various urban environments, you see what looks like Iowa or Indiana in a cornfield. And just the purity of the game, unfiltered like that and I think this really sets up for on this rewatch what seemed to be the crux of the movie to me. It establishes the wonder and purity of the sport before capitalism is sort of put on top of it at the top levels of the game, which seems to act as a sort of underlying factor that sort of takes away from the bottom of it in terms of everything that comes after that I guess we'll get to later.
Yeah, we'll get to some of the kind of deeper messaging of the movie. But in terms of going back to what you said, Mike, about growing to love it, when I was rewatching it earlier today, my girlfriend asked me if it was a basketball horror movie, because it skips back and forth to different kind of musical motifs. And like you said, it can be quite jarring. I do tend to kind of like that kind of contrapuntal thing where the music doesn't necessarily match what we're seeing on screen, because it does have that natural discord, and it makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable. And I think that was an obvious and definitely very deliberate choice by Spike Lee to try and create that feeling, because it isn't necessarily a comfortable watch due to some of its deeper messaging, like Nick suggested. Moving on, we're not going to do a scene by scene because that would be exhausting, and no one would make it to the end of the podcast. But at the opening, after that montage, it kind of cuts back and forth between Jesus and Jake shooting in their respective environments. It's jarring to see, and almost unfair to see Denzel's form in comparison to the great Ray Allen, considering he's one of the greatest shooters of all time. Did you feel that was the case, Nick?
Yes. It's one of those things, though. Denzel, I think, is very evident that he can ball from this movie. But yeah, his shooting form in comparison to one of the purest jump shots we've ever seen, it wasn't a pretty sight.
No, I mean, no one's going to look good in comparison. So it's definitely not a dig on Denzel. It's also, for me, watching the movie, it's a reminder of just how unbelievably excellent early Ray Allen was. He obviously remained a smooth player late into his NBA career and became one of the greatest shooters of all time. But his athleticism early on was really impressive, and it's really evident here. Mike, was that something that kind of took you back?
Yeah, I mean, we've had this conversation before in the Slack chat about what springs to mind. You know, which team springs to mind when you think of Ray Allen, and it's always been the Bucks for me. And it's in particular there's the dunk where he ends up horizontal, and it just like I don't think people appreciate how athletic this guy is. Certainly watching him, I mean, it's funny that we've picked to do it at this time of the year now when did you see the photo that's come out of him recently where he's refusing to shave his head? Yeah. Just like seeing him in that picture and then seeing him as a fresh-faced, he just had his rookie season, so, you know, barely into his 20s. It was an incredible comparison. Just going back to Denzel's form, that behind the head sort of short man release was just it's amazing. I remember the first time I saw it, I was just like, what is this guy doing? But you know, we'll get to it later in the film. If you've given up that many inches, you need a shot that launches from that far back. Yeah, you need the high arc to evade the defender's wandering hands. Yeah, the one-on-one scene is, for me, one of the great, really, basketball scenes in a movie. Would you agree with that? Obviously, some really good trash talk within the scene, but it's been widely discussed about Denzel actually pissing Ray off in this scene because he was supposed to let him score more, and actually he started to overplay him. Can you tell, Nick? Is this? I think you can really tell it's a competitive game of basketball, and you kind of recognise the weird tension. Did you feel that way?
Yeah, and I think it's a good comparison. I think with the last movie podcast we did where we watched White Men Can't Jump, and as good as the on-court action is in that movie, if you play basketball, you can actually sort of tell how much of it is choreographed versus in a scene like this, which I think was really the goal of the movie, to really achieve authenticity with... we already talked about things like the fashion and the Public Enemy soundtrack, but also what's happening on the court. There's a reason he cast Ray Allen, for example, to play this prospect who seemed to have everything from the perfect jump shot to the athleticism, like we talked about. And there's a reason why he cast Denzel, not only Spike Lee and Denzel having such a good relationship, but the fact he can actually ball and not kind of disgrace himself even going against an NBA player.
And you touched on it there, really. There's a reason why these people are involved in the film. There's a reason Public Enemy are involved in the film. There's a reason that Spike Lee is involved in the film. there's a reason that Denzel Washington is involved in the film. He's had a couple of moments, questionable moments within the culture, I'm led to believe. Obviously, we're three white men above 30, so we can't speak to it too much. But it did seem as though it was a bit of a perfect storm within black popular culture at that point. But there's a reason. Everything's quite deliberate in this movie, and I think that it's expertly made. But just to move on to some of the kind of themes and messages behind it, you can really tell early on that it's a Spike Lee movie because it's obvious and unashamedly socially conscious from the beginning. You know, have you both seen the film Get Out?
I've not seen it yet.
Yeah, so Nick, the dad who is pretending to try and relate to Daniel Kaluuya, the warden at the beginning of this movie, reminded me of that character. You know, when he kind of says, James Naismith knew what he was doing, right? Hell of a game. Similar vibes, equally as cringy. Did you kind of get that was the kind of theme he was trying to go for in this movie long before Jordan Peele even touched it?
Yes, and I'm going to get quite deep in how I talk about this. So Spike Lee's production company is called 40 Acres and a Mule, and the reason why it's called that is actually from it's a quirk of history where after the US Civil War, this is essentially what the freed slaves were promised as it's laughable obviously, but an attempt at some level of compensation for what they'd endured. And so the idea was that each freed slave would be able to claim 40 acres from former landowners, slave owners, and the army would lend them a mule so they could work the land and earn a living. And this went on for a number of years until Abraham Lincoln gets assassinated and Andrew Johnson becomes president, and they essentially just give it back. They take all the land again and give it back to the landowners who had it previously, the white guys who seceded from the Union, which actually mirrors very much what happens in this movie, where everything is promised to Jake in terms of he's going to get out of his bondage, to draw the parallel there, and then it seems that he's achieved what was wanted, and then at the very end of the movie you realise they're just going to take it back again anyway. So I just thought that was an interesting parallel.
Very good. I mean, also that concept has been referenced by other kind of giants of the culture. I mean, Kendrick Lamar referenced 40 Acres and a Mule in his movie For Free. And it's something that is it also, that kind of concept of the empty promises that were provided, also referenced in songs by Randy Newman and people like that. So that's a really good reference there, Nick. I mean, I've read a fair bit of the critique that suggests Spike used the vehicle to comment on specifically the commerce of male black athletes. Obviously that you can dig really deep into that, but that really stood out for both of you. Is that right, Mike?
Yeah, absolutely. And it stood out more and more the older I've got watching it. If you look at all the positions of power in this film and the majority of the corrupt individuals in it, it all sort of stems from a white guy, and it's all about capitalizing on the black man's skill. And yeah, it doesn't sit as comfortable with me like watching it these days, because I'm aware of it more. And I don't know if sit comfortably is the right sort of expression. It just sort of jars me more now watching it, because it's not hard to imagine that is actually the case. If you look at the way the NBA is now in terms of black owners, there's MJ. Steve Smith's part of the group, but the vast majority of everything else is a white man. It's really a fantastic observation by Nick, and it's jarringly obvious that in terms of characters who have are redeeming themselves or are positive. In terms of white guys in that film, you've got literally Crudup, who I love the way that you mentioned about the warden trying to sort of make friends with Jake at the start. He's like, yeah, Spivey, you'll like him, he's black.
Yeah.
It's like as if, yeah, okay, so you must get on. And actually you find that Crudup's actually the warmer officer. And then obviously the Milla Jovovich character has a sort of a redemption arc to her narrative. But other than that, it doesn't paint white people in a great light, and that's fair enough, because I can absolutely see why that is the perception on a huge scale.
Yeah, I mean, that's once again clearly a very kind of intentional feeling created by Spike Lee. He does it in a lot of his movies, and that's what makes him such a great kind of provocateur. But the whole basis of the plot would make some people think it's actually quite ludicrous how crooked the college recruitment process is in this film, including conversations I've had with my friends who have said, "What? That's the idea behind the film." But I actually think it's fair to say, as a hardcore basketball fan, that you're not actually that skeptical about the plot of this movie, because everybody in his life is trying to extort his worth. Agents, his girlfriend, his family, his coach. Any thoughts on how this portrays the process, Nick, and how kind of accurate you think that might be?
Yeah, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what we were just the subject we talked about previously, where in terms of people and black athletes and the relationship to commerce. And what I kind of mentioned when we did the White Men Can't Jump pod, that I used to watch these movies as a kid or a teenager, and anything that wasn't a basketball scene would essentially be useless to me. It was wiped from my memory, and it had no use for me based on what I was interested in and at my age and, I guess, maturity at that age. Watching this back, the most painful but seemingly very obvious parallel being drawn in this movie that previously had seemed like a random tangent was actually the character of the prostitute that Jake has a relationship with in this movie seems like a very obvious parallel to what's occurring with Jesus's character in terms of the person and their relationship to money for what they can offer. And Jesus's character throughout the whole movie, as you've already alluded to, every person in his life seems to just want to extract money for his ability, which is essentially the same arc of Milla Jovovich. I forget her actual name in the movie. Dakota, yes, who actually has a very similar arc towards the end of the movie as well, where you actually see her having used her ability, shall we say, to save up some money and escape to what looks like may be either North or South Dakota, but based on the rural scene you see her driving away into. So they're very closely aligned, those characters, and I think it really speaks to the parallel Spike Lee's trying to make in this movie. Moving on to the college recruitment process, the thing that I found deliberately silly was I understand why it happened and why it did, in that was the names of the colleges. So the two most mentioned, obviously they include, you see in the montages, you see Roy Williams, who was at Kansas at this point, you see Dean Smith from North Carolina, you see John Thompson from Georgetown, you see all sorts of Rick Pitino from the Celtics, you see all sorts of coaches at this point. But the big ones mentioned are Big State and Tech University. And I understand why they're doing it, because they didn't want the movie to actually sort of accuse any specific universities of recruiting violations. But it also seemed to make the point for me that these deliberately generic named universities, it didn't really matter what the university was, because they're all the same, is the kind of message I took away from that.
Did you clock the nickname of Tech U?
No.
It was the Vultures.
Right.
Very
which
smart.
Is, there is some clever... There's definitely a heightened level of awareness and thought going into this.
If not a little bit on the nose, Spike. But yeah, very good very good observations again, Nick. Aren't you a smart cookie? But you mentioned Rick Pitino, and actually one kind of look at his Wikipedia or read up on his coaching history, especially within the last decade, qualifies the plot as fairly feasible, does it not?
Oh, 100%. The only part of this plot line I've found slightly ridiculous and not quite believable was the fact that someone would be released from prison to start it, to try and sort this out in the first place. You know, you've got 1 week to do this. Here's a free pass. That bit I was like, okay, I feel like this is stretching it, and that just might be me being naive.
No,
but everything else, you know, the recruitment process. Rick Fox as Chick Deegan. Just, you know, the whole conversations they're having, that scene in the dorms where they go through, and I believe the ladies he meets are both actually adult entertainers, shall we say. You believe,
do you?
I can absolutely see that. I see that happening. I wonder whether it's as rife or as obvious now, given that this is pre, you know, social media, smartphones, etc. So there was less chance of it. You know, it was easier to keep under wraps, as it were. But
I mean, there were reports of Pitino specifically buying prostitutes, not him, but his assistant, buying prostitutes for these guys, these young players. So that side of things is probably not absurd. But you're right in terms of the early release from prison to get this done. I think the story is told in an almost a comic book style of storytelling, but I actually think the things that happened aren't beyond the realm of possibility, especially when you read up on other very shady recruitment processes of collegiate athletes. But you're right. I think some bits of the dialogue and some kind of plot lines does kind of stink of when a writer and director kind of really, really want to say things, and sometimes to the detriment of the enjoyment of the film. I love the movie, but sometimes they kind of speak in a way that no human beings would ever speak to each other because they really want to crowbar some messaging and some rhetoric in there. For example, some of them, they tie in some of the religious rhetoric around his name, Jesus, and then they talk about Moses, and then there's that Samson and Delilah relationship thread that's kind of shoved in the middle of it. Did you think that sometimes the dialogue did kind of give across that kind of someone's trying to say too much in one film kind of vibe, Nick?
Yeah, I can see where you're going with that, and particularly a movie like this that on rewatching has some quite clear messaging. I think in terms of trying to do too much in one film, I think one of the things I found interesting on the rewatch was I couldn't even, in trying to make my mind up on what the big messages were. Some of them were obvious, but some of them were actually more complicated. So I will get specific, don't worry. When we've talked about a sort of vaguely anti-capitalist message coming out of this, and that somehow spoiling the purity of the religion that is basketball, we find out that that Jesus' name is not actually after the character from the Bible, but actually Earl Monroe. So he draws that parallel to basketball itself actually being the religion, not Christianity. But in following this sort of anti-capitalist message that we've already talked about, there's also other things that seem to go against that. For example, the celebratory Jordan ad that happens halfway through the movie where he picks up the Jordan 13s in the shop, which is not the first time there's been essentially a Jordan ad in the middle of a Spike Lee movie. Do the Right Thing famously also had one. And obviously his character Mars Blackman being in the Jordan ads themselves, which is a bit self-referential obviously. But the movie itself, not only for its celebration of sneaker culture, but the movie itself obviously also had a relationship with Nike and Jordan brand, because every single sneaker in the movie is one or the other. So even, and obviously we're talking about a Hollywood production anyway, which is hard to, if you're some level of hardcore Marxist, you'd laugh at the idea of it being anti-capitalist anyway. But it kind of, it tinted the message for me as to it being more in terms of a warning for like prospects about the lack of genuine interest in their lives compared to their basketball abilities, rather than a purely anti-capitalist one. And I think that's where I saw the most, where what was quite a simple message on the surface becoming a bit muddied.
Do you think I think the reference to Jordan and Nike is more specific. Than I think it is. I wonder how much involvement Jordan had in this film happening. Like this, and this is me conspiracy theory.
His image is used quite regularly, and he he says, he got game.
He's the only one who says the title line.
Yeah.
Obviously, they're wearing Jordans throughout. Obviously, there's a pair of foam posits and a pair of pennies, I want to say, that spring to mind as well. But the main focus is on these Jordan 13s, which are now known as the He's Got Game 13s. Ray Allen was a Jordan athlete, and they actually, if you notice, they use Wilson balls. And MJ had a deal with them, so I'm wondering. I'm like, I know obviously there's the connection between Spike and MJ anyway, but it seems I wouldn't be surprised if he had a bigger hand in this than we know.
There's probably a period of time around then that basically, if you're a big figure in pop culture and you're going to touch anything related to basketball, at that point you basically couldn't do it without running it by Jordan.
It's perhaps why The Last Dance hasn't come out till now, is because he wanted control of that as well.
Yeah, exactly. I also think another message, that another theme that it kind of taps into, looking back at it now, is the idea of kind of toxic masculinity, I guess, in a roundabout way, and archaic, hard-nosed coaching methods that have become widely a thing of the past and have been kind of heavily debated over time. Mike, did you get that? Did you find it a bit uncomfortable to watch that side of things?
Yeah, definitely. There was, and again, I thought it was cleverly done though, in the way that we see obviously the scenes with Jake and Jesus, a young Jesus, being sort of pushed around the court and bullied, and to try toughen him up the old school way, and then it's weird how that forces Jesus to air quotes quit and throw the ball, and yet we see in other scenes that he also, despite having the absence, we don't really know what the time gap is. It's obviously a few years because he's grown quite a lot. Not had a father figure for that long, the way he deals with Mary, his sister, at times is also quite like that. Mm-hmm. And in terms of, I think he grabs her arm at one point and pulls her, and watching stuff like that, I was a bit like, okay, I'm not sure how I feel about this, but I don't think it would happen. I say I don't think it would happen. I don't think it would be portrayed necessarily like that these days. And that's me again being idealistic, because I know for a fact the whole point of it was to try and shake people and jar people, and like that was his influence. Mm-hmm. That's probably why he acted out like that. And I think it gets nicely wrapped up at the end, where what you've already mentioned about what Jake says as he's leaving, like, you've got to get that hate out your heart, otherwise you're going to end up, just like me, essentially.
Mm-hmm. And I think ultimately the movie is tied together by that thread of fatherhood, which tends to be something that holds a lot of the great movies together. Did you think that was really quite a significant theme of the movie, Nick?
Yeah, completely. But also motherhood, I think, when you see what Jesus' mother meant to him, and the loss of his mother and what that has done to him. I think both the importance of motherhood and fatherhood is played in there. Going back to the masculinity comment, I think it's a difficult subject in this movie, where it's portrayed, and you see that Jake's character may or may not have had some level of alcoholism, drinking on the court, drinking when he got home, which leads to the accidental. It's described as a murder, but when you see it, it seems to be more accidental than anything. I guess it would be called manslaughter in this country, of his wife and Jesus's mother. But I think it's also not necessarily celebrated, that culture, in terms of it leads to ultimately the consequences of him going to jail, the conflict between him and his son. What's interesting, I guess, is the different relationship he has with his daughter. You notice that she doesn't seem to, whether it's because she was so much younger at the time, it's difficult to know, but she seems to already have the better relationship and to have forgiven him when she sees him out of jail for the first time.
Yeah, I think that's...
She also wasn't there as well.
Yeah, she wasn't there.
True.
And she's... Younger children generally aren't going to know as much about it, and are going to probably be more susceptible to affection from the parents regardless. Before we move on to trivia, I just want to talk about the final scene. It's probably the only scene really that I thought didn't work. I have this thing with my friends over the years. We've always taken the piss a little bit out of that kind of final scene of a sitcom where the guy goes over to the light switch, looks around at an empty room, does that kind of exhale and shakes his head and smirks a little bit to say, like, basically with every part of their body and with their facial expression, they're saying, oh, haven't we had a good time here? Or something like that just seems a bit too on the nose. So basically every time I walk over to a light switch, I want to do that. But regardless, that really kind of in your face thing where someone will just kind of smirk as if to say, oh, well, after all this, hey? I felt that way about the final scene when seemingly Jake has thrown the ball from another dimension. Is that fair to say, Nick?
Yeah, I think you have to obviously view that metaphorically, and the reason why I'm not disagreeing, I'm not sure it worked how Spike Lee intended it to work, but how I interpreted the I guess the ending of the movie is I actually go back to the opening montage and what we discussed about the purity of the game when it's removed from all the complications, and we see that going back to the one-on-one. So Jesus's whole, you don't actually see him play that much basketball in the movie. It's just people talking about money and how rich he's going to be and that sort of thing. So actually, back on the court, one-on-one, just two guys in a hoop, it's kind of going back to that level of purity of the game that we've already established his father and increasingly him have seen as this quasi-religion. And so I think getting it towards the messaging, it kind of creates that narrative space a little bit for, as you say, a bit of disbelief and hard metaphor here when the ball lands on his court and big state and he picks it up, and it's kind of represents the I guess ultimately him forgiving his father.
Yeah, the retribution, I guess, of Jake's character. It's a wonderful film. I'm not going to sit here and criticize Spike Lee, although I'm sure he would be sitting around waiting for my judgment. But to move on to just
can I jump in on that last scene?
Go ahead.
Sorry. So, I watched it again, obviously, for this. I hadn't watched it in about 10 or 15 years. When I watched it the last time, I hated that scene. Mm-hmm. And for some reason, the movie just didn't sit with me anymore. And I watched it again and loved it again. And that final scene to me, I think I finally got it. Like I have laughed at it before and gone, what is this all about? And to me, it's literally passing the rock. Mm-hmm. It's literally that, and it's metaphorical, obviously. But this relationship between Jesus and Jake was destroyed by basketball and the pursuit of greatness. And, it destroyed everything. Essentially, it left two kids without parents. It ended one guy's freedom. It ended we don't talk about it enough. It ended. I can't remember her name now, but Martha. It ended Martha's life, and it was all because of this ball, and yet this ball, this tattered leather, just size 7 inflates 5 to 7 pounds or 7 to 9 pounds. Can't remember off the top of my head, but it's the unbreakable bond that binds this father and son together forever. And I kind of just sat there and went, I actually got goosebumps watching it this time.
Well, you're a new father. Do you think that might have played a part there?
Do you know what? In my notes, I've got that down, that I see things quite differently now watching it, having become a father. So maybe that is part of it. Yeah,
that's quite profound. I hadn't. Sorry, go ahead, Nick.
I was just going to say, actually, that I forgot to write that in my notes, but one of the really funny things watching this movie back, and I think it's exactly what Mike's getting at, us being very similar ages, obviously, is my entire... I can't tell you how many times I've watched this movie in my teens, and obviously my aspirational figure the whole time and who I identified with was Jesus, being a young baller at that time. And it's funny, watching it back was... I no longer had that experience being 35 years old, my playing career over for what it was. We're not comparing us, obviously. But actually, not with the alpha male and murder and stuff, but the character I actually identified more watching it back was Jake this time, in terms of passing on knowledge, being the person who's been there and seen it a little bit more. And it was really funny, that change in perspective watching it back.
Yeah, and I hadn't watched it since I was about 14. And I had actually... It goes back to what you said earlier on, Nick. When you're watching this as a teenager, you're just waiting for the next time the ball's bouncing. For me, I had actually forgotten the ending. And when he steps over the out-of-bounds lines and he looks like he's going to throw the ball out... I had forgotten what happens then. And I thought he was going to get shot, and it was going to be a metaphor for, similarly to earlier in the film, where Jesus throws the ball over the fence and shouts that he quits. I thought he was metaphorically quitting when he threw the ball over and he was going to get shot. Which also...
I think that metaphor still works.
Yeah.
Despite the fact he wasn't shot, I think that throwing the ball is still him quitting what he was.
Because he's passing the rock, as you say.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what a profound realisation. Thank you very much, guys. God, I feel like a different man. Moving on to just random trivia. Firstly, Kobe was obviously meant to be who Spike originally had in mind, but he prioritised off-season training after a major playoff loss to the Utah Jazz in which he underperformed. What an unbelievable what if. If, Nick, this had Kobe Bryant as the star... It's not necessarily a better film, but it lives on as a much, much, much bigger film, doesn't it?
Yes, and I also think that my one critique of Ray Allen in this movie is just the more you watch it, the more you can't get around how wooden he is in how he delivers some of the lines, particularly in the early scenes. And I can't help but feel Kobe, being just a more emotive guy generally, would have been a better actor.
Yeah, you could argue though that with over time that this film would have had a kind of more intense kind of microscope on it, and maybe that his flaws would be exposed more because it's Kobe Bryant. I mean, Ray Allen's obviously a major star in NBA. But Kobe Bryant's on kind of that different level of popularity. But you touched then on Ray's acting ability. I thought, to be fair, considering how impressed I was by Kevin Garnett in the recent Uncut Gems performance, I think Allen had a massive sample size for a non-actor as kind of a lead character. So there are bits where he's really wooden, and one of which is the scene you spoke about where he becomes slightly aggressive with his younger sister, where at that point you're just kind of like, okay, this guy did not go to stage school. But in terms of Ray's acting ability, Mike, what are your thoughts?
I get what you're saying. again, when I watched it 15 years ago, I was just like, why did I like this film? This guy can't act. But I've watched it again now, and I'm like, I sit there and I'm just like, he's supposed to be like this naive character, and I think that woodenness kind of plays into it. Like it almost helps it in some some of the things he does, and you can see some of the times he like almost breaks character, like when he splits up with Lala when they're sat on the bench overlooking the water, and she like leans in to kiss him, and as he pulls away, he's just got this like smirk on his face. I'm like, there's no way you'd have had that, but it just sort of it lent into what I've perceived as his character's naivety. But I don't. As much as Kobe would have made the film much bigger and maybe its impact would have lasted a lot longer, I think we're right, maybe over sort of selling his ability to act. So I remember his cameo in Hang Time, and it was terrible.
But I mean, what tools is he given in comparison to Spike Lee on an episode of Hang Time? Except from an excellent theme song.
As an epic theme song. Yeah, fair.
Yeah, the TV compilation of the news featurette, I guess, of Shaq, Michael Jordan, Bill Walton, Reggie Miller, Pitino, and many more coaches that you spoke about, discussing Jesus and hyping him up, is perhaps massively unrealistic. Certainly in the modern day, that would not necessarily be a feature that would be as significant. Other cameos in the movie are Walter McCarty, Travis Best, and, as you mentioned, Rick Fox. Any other cameos that you guys spotted that were quite effective?
There's a third one, isn't there, on that team? Because you mentioned obviously Travis Best, who's Sip, Walter McCarty, who's the big guy, but the other guy is also what's he called? John Wallace, Lonnie.
Oh right, okay, yeah, John Wallace.
Yeah, so he got it as a Knicks player. Apparently, Walter McCarty was running down the court at Knicks games, saying to Spike Lee, "Cast me in a movie." So that's how he got the gig. But yeah, I think at one point I thought I'd spotted a cameo that wasn't. You know that opening where they come and take the court essentially, and Booger pulls the newspaper out of his pocket and he's waving it. They're playing against 5 other guys, and there's a big guy on that other team who seems to be doing all the damage for them. And the way it's shot, which is it's kind of chaotic and raw, and I really quite liked it in terms of it made everything look natural. As far as an active basketball scene can go, I thought for a split second it was Glenn Robinson,
right? Just
because of the Milwaukee tie in the frame, but it wasn't, because I think you see the guy do like the throat cut gesture, and that's definitely not Glenn Robinson.
No, and you mentioned John Wallace was recently in the Taz Mellis autograph drama online, which is definitely worth a Google if you haven't seen it. I thought that Rick Fox was quite interesting. You said that he played Chick, who was helping recruit Jesus. I actually thought he was kind of perfectly cast at that kind of smooth Lothario character. But I also find it really interesting when guys like Rick Fox, Walter McCarty, they're cast as not themselves but new characters. I kind of love it when that happens. It happens in like a series of TV programs and movies where you're like, okay, so hold on, is he playing himself or is he a character? Did you have a gripe with Rick Fox's character then, Mike?
No, it just made me laugh, because that's you've almost nailed it there with, is that Rick Fox or is that him playing a part? Because there used to be a podcast he was on with Sekou Smith, NBA. It's like an official NBA one, and the amount of times he'd call in and be chatting away, and I'd just be like, "You're the same guy. You just strike me as the same guy." I didn't take umbrage to it at all, because I can totally see that sort of character being the kind of player that a coach would utilise as a recruiter.
I mean, he's a handsome guy. He's going to get a lot of attention from the ladies.
Yeah, and I thought he played the part really well, to be fair to him.
the threesome scene that eventually comes from his visit to Tech University, as you mentioned, 2 real-life porn stars. Similarly, Nick, to White Men Can't Jump, I just can't believe how much sex is in this movie.
I actually think this was a politically calculated decision by Spike Lee, who obviously is essentially a black spokesman in Hollywood, which for years the idea of having interracial sex in movies was a big taboo. And so it's a real statement to not only feature it, but feature it so explicitly and so kind of for extended periods.
Yeah, and that's a massive part of the conversation he eventually has with Lala about interracial dating and the do's and don'ts of it. Another random tidbit is that Hill Harper, who plays Booger, is 31 and he's playing a teenager. Do you think that you could tell that, Mike?
I could not tell he was 31. I looked at him and he looks about 14.
Yeah, he might just have one of those faces that always just seems like a teenager.
Yeah, I mean, I've looked at him since and he hasn't really aged that much where I'd have gone, oh, if he was 31 then, he must be like mid-50s now. But I thought, that character I thought was quite good for comic relief. The bit where Jake's like, he grew a couple of inches, and he's like, oh, what you think? Oh wow, that's the best thing I've heard all day. I thought he was a good little character.
Yeah, I think so as well. And Nick, we spoke also on White Men Can't Jump. We spoke about the experience for the first time as a young man. Being introduced to Rosie Perez. I remember in this movie serving as an introduction to Rosario Dawson, and it's safe to say it was a formative moment in my teenage life. I think that, who do you think has aged better, Nick? Ray Allen, recent photographs aside, but considering his athletic capabilities into his later years, or Rosario Dawson?
Well, the picture of Ray Allen we're talking about, he actually looks like Clyde Drexler now, which is quite an achievement. If I retire to be Clyde the Glide, I'll be very happy with myself. As creepy. Did you have a? Sorry, go ahead. Creepy as it sounds. I have to pick Dawson here.
Did you have a similar awakening in this movie as you did with Perez?
Weirdly, not on the same level as you guys by the sounds of it. And I kind of registered that she was incredibly attractive, obviously, but it didn't instigate a love affair with her from afar.
And now, she's making a run at trying to be First Lady from afar with Cory Booker, is it? Her partner? Democratic nominee, he was. Well, I've clearly got my finger on the political pulse, Mike.
Yes.
The subplot with Milla Jovovich and her pimp as Jake's volatile neighbours, it seemed to be, to me, before you enlightened me with your two-headed metaphor, Nick, it seemed to me to be a bit of a plot digression, similar to the mobsters in White Men Can't Jump that didn't necessarily need to be there, but it's an extra wrinkle in the story to add a little bit of depth. While I know, obviously, it also serves as a narrative vehicle to portray Jake in a different light, and it just feels like a bit on the nose sometimes to me. I am taking it that you two disagree with me on this one.
I didn't disagree with you for a long time, until I watched it this time around. I just didn't. I was like, what is the point in this whole bit? And then Nick sort of has opened my eyes a bit as well with his analysis of that, of her whole purpose in the film.
Yeah.
So I I'm going to go and watch it again after this now, to be honest, because I kind of think I'll look at it through a different lens again. But for a long time, I did not like her character, and actually, I kind of held it against her as an actress. I just didn't rate her because of it.
Yeah, Nick, I know that you're busy and you've got your own things going on, but if I do need someone to kind of just follow me around explaining things in depth, are you open to any new employment adventures?
Yeah, I mean that's I can. I also dabble in commentating, so maybe I could just commentate on your life and analyze it as you go about it.
That'd be great. We can
in this day and age, though, you might find that following you from 2 meters behind one trip a day might be a bit weird.
Yeah, okay. You'll have to shout your commentary at this point.
A random take I have talking about that character is, and I guess my biggest critique of the movie in general, watching it in 2020, is the in terms, and I get that just by the way the narrative is framed, a lot of the female characters are more or less peripheral, but the lack of Lala's really probably the only female character with any depth at all. The mother is, you see her as very much almost like a saint-like figure, which is the classic. What you see in this movie, or what you seem to see, is the classic Madonna or a whore dynamic. Sometimes quite literally in the case of one character, but most of the women you see in this film are either desperately trying to shag Jesus, or they are a saint-like figure. Lala's the only female character I can think of in the whole movie who seems to have any agency herself, and sort of seems to be pursuing her own agenda.
Yeah, it definitely wouldn't pass is it called the Bechdel test? It's a measure of kind of representation of women in fiction, where I believe a woman and a woman need to have a conversation with each other. I don't think that actually happens at any point in the movie, does it?
I don't think so.
You're right.
And you see his auntie as well is also like very saint-like in that she's won't go along with the uncle in making the demands, and then he goes on to like claim the Lexus in Jesus' name and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think it's a large part of kind of cinema's growth in terms of its portrayal of women. The women in the movies in this movie are largely represented as higher beings, but that's not really a representation of women in film if they don't actually have a kind of significant weighty part, or they don't actually speak to each other at any point in the movie. But I'm sure that almost every movie in Hollywood at that point was similar in that respect. But we're really running up the clock here, so it's clutch time to conclude our thoughts. Mike, did you have a favourite scene of the movie?
Oh man, that's really tough. I was not expecting that. They're all on court, the ones I love. There's obviously the opening montage, absolutely love that. The initial scrimmage, I think that's fantastic. Probably the one-on-one at the end, given the sort of gravity of the scene. And the way it plays out, I'm not even sure one-on-ones happen like that anymore. Just the way that the game has evolved, and the physicality sort of gone away. Like, I don't know, I was watching it, and as we said earlier, fantastically well put together, and you could see they were actually trying for a lot of it, apart from when Jake actually does give up and is stood flat-footed, basically. But I watched it, and I mean, I haven't played one-on-one in a long time now, but I can't imagine it going down anything like that anymore.
No, stylistically it's really different. There's loads of kind of bumping in the post, a lot of kind of back to the basket play. Nowadays,
pre-analytics one-on-one.
Yeah, in 2020, 100% Jesus is kind of pulling up on him like 80% of the time and knocking him down. Nick, do you have a favourite scene?
I actually agree with all of Mike's choices, but to pick one, I think for me it has to be the opening montage.
Yeah, I kind of agree with most of them, but the opening montage has to be my favourite scene. But something else that also uses the kind of orchestral, unsettling, well, not necessarily unsettling, but definitely a counterpoint to what we're seeing visually, is the kind of Steadicam Ferris wheel scenes. Not necessarily a major part of the plot, but I thought that it seemed quite ahead of its time. You know, when they're kind of kissing and they're swinging back and forth whilst the fireworks happen in the background. I think they start having sex, and the orchestral music
can
is like...
confirm.
They can confirm. It's the kind of... I'm trying to think of the terminology. It's non-diegetic sound. It's 100% non-diegetic sound, where it's all we're hearing is the orchestral music whilst we're seeing this all play out. I just thought that was a really effective scene, and it really felt like something Spike Lee could do in 2020, and it wouldn't seem out of place. Nick, did you have a favourite line in the movie?
I think one that springs up in my mind that seems to speak to a lot of the messages we already talked about that crop up time and time again in this movie is when Jesus goes at the insistence of Lala to go and see this Italian-American agent, and he says, "Oh, I'd rather have a brother represent me." And the agent comes back and says, "You're black, I'm white. What colour is this?" holding money. And Jesus says, "Green." And he says something along the lines of, "When making business decisions, the only colour that matters is green," which kind of seemed to sum up a lot of what the movie's talking about.
Yeah, and when, by the way, Lala is in the pool, unbelievably, blatantly getting it on with your man. It's an incredible... and he kind of just looks and slightly frowns and then goes about his day. It's wonderful. Mike, do you have a favourite line in the movie?
I have two.
Go on.
The first is the one we've mentioned several times, which is get the hatred out your heart. But the big one for me is when they do the Lincoln promo, and I think this is beautifully put together, where they're all stood static, and then one of them dribbles the ball, and it clips to them saying something, and it goes back, and then two of them are dribbling the ball, and it clips to that person saying something. But Jesus says, basketball is like poetry in motion. Cross the guy to the left, take him back to the right. He's falling back, then just J right in his face. Then you look at him and say, "What?" And I just love that.
Yeah, I think it's those scenes were strange, weren't they? They were strange and wonderful at the same time. And I think that actually that's what makes it a kind of definitive Spike Lee movie as well as a basketball movie. And that's also, I think, why it's aged so well as a sports movie. Where do you think it sits in the pantheon of basketball movies, Nick?
Yeah, I have, as with all movies, I have two measures. One is in terms of actual artistic merit and genuine quality as a movie, for which it ranks extremely highly. I think it's that, and my, just to provide some context, my other measure is just shameless enjoyment, however good or bad a movie may be. Sometimes a terrible movie is actually super fun, and I also love those sorts of movies. But this one is genuinely a good movie, and I think particularly with sports movies, the real measure with them is particularly one that is so entrenched in basketball culture like this. Can a non-basketball fan watch this and enjoy the movie, and does it still work for them? And I did a live experiment yesterday with my wife in making her watch this movie, and she also loved the movie, so it's passed that test.
That's right. And if you're a basketball player, I think another test of the quality of it as a sports movie if it makes you wish you could go out there and play said sport. And even though it is quite a weighty movie, and really essentially a family soap opera, it made me want to go out and exercise, and really made me want to pick up a ball. Mike, where do you think it sits in the kind of ranking of basketball films?
I flip-flop on whether it's one or two, depending on my mood. And it's up there with White Men Can't Jump, which for some reason just I have more nostalgia for, probably because it's light-hearted and upbeat for the, there's a comical side to it. It's not 100% light-hearted and upbeat, but there's a comical side to it that just, I like that sort of thing. But when it comes to He Got Game, it's basically, there's very little comedic value to it. It is just serious and gritty, but it's just, it resonates enough with me that I sit there and flip-flop with 1 and 2.
Yeah, for those reasons, I actually thought that my favourite film, basketball film in history, was White Men Can't Jump. But actually, since rewatching He Got Game this week, I realised it's actually Uncle Drew. No, I realised actually, I personally believe, even though it becomes a bit entrenched in its kind of themes, as I said, and its subplots, and it's a very weighty drama, I think it's the best made, most ambitious, and for me, actually, incredibly enjoyable basketball movie. And I think it essentially serves as Spike Lee's complicated letter to the sport of basketball. But do you guys have any thoughts? Because I've basically exhausted myself here.
So many. Like, I mean, how long you got? Because I kind of want to dive into the Stephon Marbury angle and all things like that. So it really depends.
You can hit me with your Steph take.
So I wondered if Nick might like this too, because so Steph claims the movie's about him. And there's another guy as well who's claiming the movie's about him, whose name I can't quite remember, but I did download the introduction to his book yesterday to try and figure out whether it was. But Marbury refused to audition because he didn't want to audition to be himself, and then his agent said he won't audition without a good, guarantee of a good part. But he obviously went to Lincoln High School. This is his high school. He was a high school phenom just a few years earlier. Had to make the decision as to whether to go straight to the pros or whether to go to Georgia Tech, I want to say, where he went for a year, and then he became a pro. And so I wondered, like, obviously, the bigger concept of a high school phenom being from Lincoln seems to mirror him quite well. The dad's in jail for murder, I'm not so sure about. And I just found it really interesting that, Stephon Marbury thinks this is a film about him, and then Ray Allen ends up playing him, and these are two guys who were traded for each other on draft day in 1996, and their careers sort of go completely, there's a weird like sync to them in terms of that trade to start their career. They both come into the league at the same time. Stephon Marbury is supposed to be the bigger of the two, I think, in terms of expectations, and yet it's Ray who essentially takes his role from him to play himself, if it is about him, which Spike Lee denies, and then goes on to be the guy who has the Hall of Fame career. I just found that a really interesting sort of sidebar, if you will. Yeah,
they regularly mention that Stephon Marbury is the only guy to make it out of Coney Island to the NBA and make it big. But Nick, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting line I hadn't really thought of. And it's, to give him his full credit, it's Big Time Willie who makes that statement about Marbury.
Big Time Willie.
Who's one of my favourite minor characters in this, if anything, just because of his stupidly broad New York accent, which is incredible.
And perfect beard.
Yeah, absolutely amazing. Like a young Craig David, almost.
He's an absolute caricature of kind of what he's meant to represent, isn't he?
Yeah, but I think it's hard to refute, I think, where even within the movie they actually state Marbury's the only guy to really make it out of Coney Island like that. And you already said, Josh, there's a reason people are chosen to play people. There's a reason locations are chosen, and there's a reason Coney Island was the setting for this movie. Not only because it's sort of, it has the sort of gritty view that Spike Lee wanted for this, but he, being a New Yorker, will have actually seen this play out just a few years prior to starting to make this movie. So I think it's hard to refute that if not directly playing Marbury's character, it's more than anyone else's story. It's about him.
Okay. Any other final takes for the podcast?
One amazing tiny scene that maybe you guys didn't even pick up on, and only I did, being a Knicks fan, was that Spike Lee managed to get one tiny. It's probably like a few frames, but I managed to pick up on it, where I can't even remember what scene it's in, but someone is like closing a newspaper, and as they close it, you see on the front of the newspaper there's a photo of Patrick Ewing dunking against the Bulls, and the title is something like "Knicks beat the Bulls by 30" or something like that. I just thought that was amazing, like nod to the Knicks that he managed to get in there.
Yeah, it's a good job that we didn't have a "What's Edge the Worst" section of this podcast. Sorry, Nick. I'm sorry. That about wraps up this episode of the Double Clutch Basketball Movies podcast. Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Follow us on social media at Double Clutch UK. Until next time, it's been a pleasure, Mike.
Always a pleasure. Love talking hoops. Love talking about films that were fundamental parts of my life.
And Nick.
Thanks, everyone. And in the meantime, I will be following Josh from a distance of 2 meters, commenting and analysing as I go.
It's been a pleasure. Stay safe, everyone.
Well, Jack, I think it's time for all of us to go back home.
Okay.
No, Jack. Turn around.